Herodotus, the so-called father of history, once wrote that every single woman in Babylon had to sit in the temple of Aphrodite and have a stranger at least once in her life. He said the ugly ones sometimes waited 3 or 4 years. He also claimed that giant ants mined gold in India and that Egyptians kneaded dough with their feet. So maybe his reporting standards weren't exactly Pulitzer material. But the truth about temple prostitutes in ancient Mesopotamia, it's stranger than anything Herodotus made up. These weren't desperate women selling their bodies on some dusty street corner. Some of them were the most powerful, educated, and respected people in their entire civilization. And the story of how we got it all wrong is honestly one of history's greatest telephone games. The word prostitute is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Before we go any further, we need to talk about language. Because the phrase temple prostitute conjures up a very specific image, and that image is almost entirely wrong. Ancient Mesopotamians had at least 6 different categories of women associated with temples and sexuality. You had the harimtu, the kezertu, the kadishtu, the naditu, the ishtaritu, and the samhatu. Each word meant something different, carried different social weight, and involved wildly different daily responsibilities. Lumping them all together under temple prostitute is about as accurate as calling every single person who works at a hospital a doctor. The harimtu, for example, literally translates to the separated one, or the one set apart. Some scholars think this just meant a woman who wasn't married, not a prostitute, just single. In a culture where marriage was the default setting for women, being unmarried made you unusual enough to earn your own label. Julia Asante, an Assyriologist who spent decades on this exact question, argues that the harimtu wasn't even a profession. She was simply a woman who had control over her own sexuality. In ancient Mesopotamia, that alone was enough to make you suspicious. The kezertu, her name means the one with curled hair. That's it. We think she was associated with Ishtar's temple, but we're not entirely sure what she did there beyond having great hair. The kadishtu translates to the consecrated one, which sounds religious, because it was, but consecrated and prostitute are not the same word, no matter how badly later translators wanted them to be. This confusion isn't ancient, it's modern. When 19th century European scholars started translating Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, they brought their Victorian anxieties along for the ride. They saw references to women, temples, and sexuality, and they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. The result was a narrative that stuck for over a century. Ancient pagans loved women were objects for the gods, and civilization only got respectable once monotheism showed up. Almost none of that is supported by the actual clay tablets. Meet Inanna, the goddess who started everything. To understand anything about temples in ancient Mesopotamia, you have to understand Inanna. Or Ishtar, if you're speaking Akkadian. Same goddess, different century, even bigger reputation. Inanna was the Sumerian goddess of love, war, fertility, political power, and general chaos. She's one of the oldest documented deities in human history, with hymns dating back to roughly 3500 BC. She was worshipped across Mesopotamia for over 3,000 years, which means she was culturally relevant for longer than Christianity has existed. Sit with that for a second. Her personality, based on the surviving literature, was absolutely unhinged. She once descended into the underworld just to crash her sister Ereshkigal's party, got herself killed, was hung on a meat hook as a rotting corpse, and then got resurrected through a combination of trickery and divine loopholes. When she got back to the living world, she was so annoyed that her husband Dumuzi hadn't mourned her properly that she sent demons to drag him to the underworld in her place. Relationship goals. The first known author in human history, Enheduanna, was a high priestess of the moon god Nanna, and she wrote elaborate hymns about Inanna around 2300 BC. A woman writing poetry about a goddess of war before the concept of an author even existed in most of the world. Enheduanna described Inanna as terrifying, beautiful, and completely unpredictable. She wrote, "You are lofty like heaven, let it be known. You are broad like the earth, let it be known." That's the world's first known writer, hyping up a goddess of love and destruction. Shakespeare was about 3,800 years late. Inanna's temples weren't quiet meditation spaces, they were the economic, political, and social hearts of their cities. The Inanna precinct in Uruk, her most famous temple complex, was a massive walled compound with courtyards, storerooms, workshops, and shrines that had been rebuilt and expanded across millennia starting around 4000 BC. Worshippers entering the complex had to walk through a processional sequence of forecourts, ascend stairways, and pass through multiple terrace levels before reaching the top. Think less neighborhood church and more Vatican City meets Wall Street. The temple employed scribes, accountants, weavers, brewers, musicians, and yes, women whose roles involved sexuality. But reducing all of that to prostitution temple is missing the forest for one very specific tree: the sacred marriage. Ancient Mesopotamia's spiciest ritual. Once a year in ancient Sumer, the king of a city-state would participate in a ritual called the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage. During this ceremony, the king would have ritualized with the high priestess, who was acting as the earthly vessel of Inanna. The belief was straightforward. This union released divine fertile energy across the land, ensuring good crops, healthy livestock, and general prosperity. No pressure. Was this religious? Absolutely. Was it sexual? Obviously. Was it prostitution? That's where things get tricky. The high priestess, who participated in the sacred marriage, held one of the most powerful positions in all of Sumer. She was chosen specifically for this role, trained for it, and revered for it. Calling her a prostitute would be something along the lines of calling the Pope a motivational speaker. Technically involves public speaking, but you're really missing the point. The sacred marriage also wasn't a free-for-all. It was one specific ritual, performed at one specific time, involving two specific people, for one specific religious purpose. It had rules. It had political implications. The king's participation legitimized his rule. Without the goddess's approval through this union, his authority was questionable. So if anything, the priestess had leverage over the king, not the other way around. We know about the sacred marriage primarily through Sumerian love poetry, which is some of the steamiest literature from the ancient world. These poems describe the priestess preparing for the ritual, bathing, adorning herself, and then engaging in explicit but reverent acts with the king. The language is tender, mutual, and honestly better than a lot of modern romance novels. He shaped my with his fair hands, reads one poem. The shepherd Dumuzi filled my with cream and milk. Ancient Sumerians did not believe in subtlety, and this poetry wasn't hidden away in some back room. It was public, performed at festivals, celebrated. The biggest of these was the Akitu festival, a New Year celebration that could last up to 12 days and involved the entire city of Babylon. During the Akitu, Inanna's relationship to divine kingship and agricultural fertility was ritually dramatized for enormous crowds. Priests recited the creation epic. The king's power was symbolically stripped and then restored by the gods. And the sacred marriage was the climax of the whole affair, both figuratively and literally. The idea that sex between these two people could bring divine blessings to an entire nation was treated with the same seriousness that we might treat a presidential inauguration, except with more nudity and better poetry. The Naditu, nuns who could buy and sell you. If anyone completely destroys the helpless temple prostitute narrative, it's the Naditu. The Naditu were priestesses dedicated to the sun god Shamash, best documented from the city of Sippar between roughly 1880 and 1550 BC. Their name comes from the Akkadian word, meaning fallow, as in a field left unplanted. The metaphor referred to their most defining restriction. They were forbidden from having children. But don't confuse no children with no power. The Naditu were some of the most economically powerful people in Babylonian society. Full stop. Not most powerful women. Most powerful people. They could buy, sell, and inherit property. They managed herds. They ran farms. They made business loans. They owned slaves. They accumulated wealth across generations, passing property to other Naditu women in their families. In a society where most women's legal identities were tied to their husbands or fathers, the Naditu operated as independent economic agents with their own lawyers, their own contracts, and their own money. They lived in a special quarter of Sippar called the Gagum, or cloister, near the temple of Shamash. Girls typically became Naditu around age 15. The initiation ceremony involved placing a rope associated with Shamash on the new Naditu's arm, and her family was required to provide a written guarantee that they'd support her financially. After that, she was Shamash's woman. Here's where it gets interesting. In Sippar, Naditu women could marry, but they couldn't have children with their husbands. Instead, their husbands often took secondary wives for childbearing, while the Naditu maintained her religious status and, critically, her property rights. Some scholars have compared the arrangement to medieval European convents, where wealthy families placed daughters to manage surplus inheritance and maintain family connections to religious power. Except the Naditu were way better at business. The Code of Hammurabi, that famous Babylonian law code carved in stone around 1754 BC, dedicates several laws specifically to Naditu women. Law 110 states that if a Naditu who doesn't live in the cloister opens a tavern or enters one for a drink, she shall be burned. For entering a bar. Law 178 guarantees her inheritance rights. The fact that a king felt the need to carve specific laws about these women into a public stone monument tells you exactly how important they were. You don't write laws about people you can ignore. Since they couldn't bear children, many Naditu adopted kids to care for them in old age. And unlike other women in Babylonian society, they could will their property to female heirs. This created multi-generational networks of wealthy, educated, independent women operating within an explicitly religious framework. Calling them prostitutes isn't just wrong, it's historically illiterate. Shamhat and the civilizing power of sex. This might be the part that actually sounds familiar, even if you don't realize it yet. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature on the planet, there's a character named Shamhat. She's described as a harimtu, a temple woman of Ishtar, and her role in the story changed the course of world literature. Enkidu, a wild man created by the gods to humble the arrogant king Gilgamesh, lives in the wilderness among animals. He runs with gazelles, he drinks at watering holes. He's essentially Tarzan, but 4,000 years earlier and with considerably more body hair. A hunter discovers Enkidu and panics because this wild man keeps freeing animals from his traps. Bad for business. So the hunter goes to Uruk and asks for help. Gilgamesh's solution? Send Shamhat. Not a warrior, not a trapper, a temple woman. Shamhat goes to the watering hole and does her thing. She and Enkidu have for 6 days and 7 nights straight. After this marathon session, the animals reject Enkidu. They run from him. He's no longer one of them. He's been civilized. But Shamhat's work isn't done. She then teaches Enkidu how to eat bread, drink beer, wear clothes, and groom himself. She literally transforms him from an animal into a person, and the text treats this as a noble, important, sacred act. Shamhat isn't degraded by the story. She's the catalyst for one of the most important character transformations in literary history. The Mesopotamians saw it clearly. Sexual knowledge was a marker of civilization itself. It separated humans from animals. And the woman who carried that knowledge? She wasn't a victim or an outcast. She was an agent of human progress. The tablets don't shy away from what Shamhat does, but they also don't treat it as shameful. She's presented as essential. Without her, Enkidu would still be licking salt deposits and headbutting deer. There's a telling detail in the text that most people miss. After Shamhat civilizes Enkidu, the narrative says he had become wiser and his understanding had broadened. The Sumerian word used here, hasisu, means both wisdom and sexual awareness. For the Mesopotamians, those were the same thing. Knowing your body and knowing the world weren't separate categories. They were one and the same. And the woman who unlocked that knowledge wasn't offering a service. She was performing a sacred transformation. Herodotus and the biggest lie in classical history. Time to address the Greek tourist in the room. Around 450 BC, the Greek historian Herodotus visited Babylon and wrote about what he called the most shameful custom he'd ever encountered. According to his account, every Babylonian woman, rich or poor, beautiful or ugly, was required to sit in the temple of Mylitta, his Greek name for Ishtar, at least once in her life. She had to wait until a stranger walked up, threw a silver coin in her lap, and said, "I summon you in the name of the goddess Mylitta." She then had to go with this man. No choosing, no refusing. This account has been quoted, repeated, illustrated, and cited for over 2,000 years. It's been in encyclopedias, textbooks, and documentary narration. And most scholars today think it's complete garbage. First, there's no corroborating evidence from Mesopotamian sources themselves. We have hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, legal texts, temple records, economic documents, personal letters, hymns, myths. Not a single one describes anything resembling what Herodotus described. Not one. You'd think a practice involving literally every woman in a major city would generate some paperwork. Second, Herodotus had a pattern of inventing or exaggerating barbarian customs to make them seem exotic and shocking to his Greek audience. This is the same writer who described giant gold-digging ants in India and claimed that Arabian sheep had tails so fat they needed little carts to carry them around. He was writing entertainment for Greeks who'd never been to Babylon, not peer-reviewed anthropology. Third, later Roman authors took Herodotus's account and inflated it further. By the time it filtered through centuries of retelling, the narrative had ballooned into something completely unrecognizable from whatever kernel of truth might have existed. Stephanie Boudin, in her book, The Myth of Sacred Prostitution in Antiquity, argues convincingly that the entire concept of mandatory religious was a Greek and Roman invention, projected onto cultures they didn't understand and didn't particularly want to understand. The irony is thick. Herodotus, a man from a civilization where women couldn't vote, own property, or appear in public without a male guardian, decided that Babylonian women, who could own businesses, file for divorce, and serve as powerful priestesses, were the degraded ones. The projection would be impressive if it weren't so damaging. The tavern scene. Even if the grand, sacred prostitution narrative is mostly fiction, sex absolutely existed in ancient Mesopotamia, but it looked very different from the temple fantasies later writers concocted. Much of the actual trade happened at taverns, not temples. Taverns in ancient Mesopotamia were run by women called alewives, which is exactly what it sounds like, women who brewed and served beer. Beer was massive in Mesopotamia. They had over 20 different types, and the oldest known recipe for beer comes from a Sumerian poem called the Hymn to Ninkasi, dedicated to the goddess of brewing. They drank beer through long straws from communal pots, which sounds like a college party but was actually a sophisticated cultural practice with thousands of years of tradition behind it. These taverns were hubs of social activity, and yes, some of them also facilitated work. Harimtu women often found customers at tavern doorways or along city walls. The law codes drew sharp lines between who could and couldn't enter these establishments. A Naditu caught in a tavern could be executed. This tells us two things. Taverns were closely associated with commerce, and Mesopotamians drew rigid distinctions between different categories of women. A Naditu was not a harimtu. Mixing them up would have been profoundly offensive. The alewives themselves were a fascinating category. They were essentially self-employed entrepreneurs in an era when most people worked for temples or palaces. They brewed their own product, managed their own premises, set their own prices. Some of them got so successful that the law codes had to regulate them. The Code of Hammurabi, Law 108, says that if an alewife refuses to accept grain as payment and instead demands silver, or if she gives short measures of beer relative to the grain received, she shall be thrown into the water, drowning for watering down the beer. The Mesopotamians did not mess around about their alcohol. The Epic of Gilgamesh features a divine alewife named Siduri, who gives the grief-stricken Gilgamesh some of the most famous philosophical advice in ancient literature. Eat well, dress nicely, hold your child's hand, and make your wife happy. For a bartender in a story written 4,000 years ago, that's remarkably solid life coaching. Gender benders of Ishtar's court. This is the part that really breaks modern assumptions about the ancient world, because people tend to imagine it as rigidly binary. It wasn't. Especially not in Ishtar's temples. Ishtar's cult included a group of people called the Gala, or later the Kulu'u, who were male-bodied individuals who took on feminine roles in temple rituals. They sang in a dialect called Emsal, the women's language of Sumerian. They performed laments. They carried out rituals specifically associated with femininity. Some texts suggest they underwent physical transformation. There were also the Asinu, the Kurgaru, and other gender-variant temple functionaries who played important roles in Ishtar's worship. The goddess herself was associated with the transformation and blurring of gender boundaries. One Sumerian hymn describes her power: "To turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man are yours, Inanna." These weren't marginalized people hiding in shadows. They were official temple personnel with defined roles, duties, and recognized social positions. Recent analysis of cuneiform texts by researchers found that these gender-diverse individuals held positions of genuine power. They weren't just tolerated, they were considered sacred, touched by Ishtar's transformative energy. In the myth of Inanna's descent to the underworld, it's actually a Gala-like being, the Asinu Asushunamir, who rescues the goddess from death. Ereshkigal, queen of the dead, is so charmed by this being that she grants a wish, and Asushunamir uses it to retrieve Inanna's corpse and bring her back to life. The savior of the most powerful goddess in the Mesopotamian pantheon was a gender non-conforming temple servant. Try explaining that to the Victorian scholars who first used the phrase temple prostitute and assumed ancient Mesopotamia was one big scandal. What actually happened to them? The temple systems of Mesopotamia didn't collapse overnight. They eroded across centuries as empires rose and fell. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Each new ruling culture brought its own attitudes about women and religion, and each one scraped away a little more of what came before. The Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great in 539 BC marked the beginning of the end for independent Mesopotamian temple culture. Cyrus was relatively tolerant, but the infrastructure of the old system was already crumbling. Temples lost their economic independence. Priestess orders shrank. The Gagum in Sippar went quiet. The Greeks who followed Alexander's conquest in 331 BC brought their own deeply patriarchal worldview. And when Christianity and later Islam spread across the region, the old temple systems were systematically dismantled and their practices reinterpreted as evidence of pagan depravity. The concept of sacred prostitution became a convenient weapon. Early Christian writers pointed to Mesopotamian temple practices as proof that paganism was morally bankrupt. They cited Herodotus as fact, despite having zero independent evidence. The narrative served a clear purpose. It made the old religions look corrupt and the new one look necessary. The actual women who served in these temples, the Naditu managing property portfolios bigger than most modern investment firms, the Ntu priestesses conducting state-level political rituals, the Harimtu women navigating complex social positions, got flattened into a single scandalous stereotype. Thousands of years of nuanced, diverse female experience reduced to one word: prostitute. What we know and what we don't. Here's the honest truth. We still don't fully understand what happened in Mesopotamian temples. We have fragments, legal codes, myths, and hymns. Tourist accounts from a Greek guy who also believed in gold-digging ants. But we don't have a single comprehensive first-hand account from a woman who actually served in one of these temples. Their voices were filtered through male scribes, foreign travelers, and centuries of religious bias. What we do know is that the ancient Mesopotamians had a relationship with sexuality fundamentally different from anything that came after. They saw as a civilizing force, not a corrupting one. They gave women religious roles that came with real economic and political power. They recognized gender diversity as sacred rather than deviant. And they kept this going for roughly 3,000 years, making it one of the longest-running social experiments in human history. The Naditu priestesses ran business empires. Shamhat turned a wild man into a human being through the act of love, and Inanna wrote the first known poetry. The Gala performed sacred rituals that challenged the very concept of gender, and somewhere in between all of that, regular women navigated a world where sexuality, divinity, and commerce were tangled together in ways that would make a modern televangelist pass out and a gender studies professor take furious notes. So the next time someone drops the phrase, temple prostitute, and expects you to picture something scandalous, just remember, you're hearing the version told by the people who conquered them, burned their records, and built churches on their foundations. Maybe take that with a grain of salt, a Mesopotamian grain, naturally. They invented agriculture too.